All right, part 5 of this unit is about limiting reactants. Limiting reactants and excess reactants, let's not forget them, are covered in section 9.3, sections A and B in your book. When we use the word limiting reactant, or sometimes you'll see it written as limiting reagent, which means the same thing. A reagent is a substance that you use in a reaction. A limiting reagent is something that limits how much of a product you can make. In other words, it is the reactant that is used up first in a chemical equation. So if you have two chemicals that you mix together, one of them is going to get used up first while the other one is still present. The thing that gets used up is called the limiting reactant. It determines the amount of product that is formed because it's the thing that runs out. For example, let's think about sandwiches. I have to confess, I'm really hungry right now, and this is making me starving to look at this picture of this beautiful sandwich. Say you were going to make sandwiches. We're going simplistic here. Say you had 80 pieces of meat. On this sandwich that we drew here, I believe we counted that there were 8 pieces of meat in each sandwich, and there were 2 slices of bread in each sandwich, right? So from my 80 pieces of meat, how many sandwiches could I make? I could make 10 sandwiches. From my 6 slices of bread, how many sandwiches could I make? I could make 3 because each sandwich requires 2 slices of bread. How many sandwiches can I actually make using the meat and the bread before somebody runs out? Well, I've got enough meat to make 10 sandwiches, but only enough bread to make 3. The answer would be that I could make 3 sandwiches out of these materials. I'm going to have something left over, right? The bread, in this case, is the thing I had less of, the thing that ran out first. That means that the bread would be my limiting reactant. Limiting reactant is often abbreviated LR. In this example, the bread would be my limiting reactant because it runs out first. Somebody else is still present when the reaction's done. That would be the meat. The meat would be my excess reactant. Excess is a word that means like extra or more than enough. An excess reactant is the opposite of the limiting reactant. The limiting reactant is the one that gets used up. An excess reactant is the reactant that does not get used up in a chemical reaction. In other words, some of it is going to be left over at the end. In this example, this would be the meat. Because the meat is left after we've already made our 3 sandwiches, we have some meat left over. Now, limiting reactant problems can get pretty involved. These are the longest problems we do in this chapter. That's why it's the last section. In order to calculate or determine the limiting reactant, we have a series of steps we can do. The first step is actually really simple. It just says to balance the chemical equation. Most of the time, or some of the time, a chemical equation that you're given is already balanced. This is kind of a, in case it's not already balanced, then you need to do it. The second step that you do is you choose one of the products to find. Remember, the products are the things on the right side of the arrow. They're the things that are being made in a reaction. So they're not the things you start with, but the things you end with. And we choose one of the products. Sometimes a reaction only has one, sometimes it has multiple products. We pick just one of them. Once you've decided on a product, and it really doesn't matter which one you choose, just pick one, then what you do is you calculate how much of that product can be formed based on each reactant. Normally in our problems, we deal with reactions that have 2 reactants in them. Because we have 2 reactants and we have to do a calculation for each of them, what this means is we have to do 2 calculations. I would write this on your paper because the key thing you need to know about limiting reactants is that they require not 1, but 2 stoichiometry calculations. You already know how to do these calculations, it's just you're used to doing them only 1 at a time. So we'll do 2 at a time here. So this calculation, or these 2 calculations, is kind of what we did in the example about how many sandwiches could we make from the meat and how many from the bread. Which, once you've done those calculations, what you're looking at then is how much each one made. In other words, I could have gotten 10 sandwiches from my meat, but only 3 sandwiches from the bread. Whichever one produces less of the product, so in other words, the smaller number, whichever one gives you a smaller amount of product is your limiting reactant. The limiting reactant is the thing that runs out first. And remember, we often abbreviate this LR. So you do the two calculations, you compare the answers and see which one gives you less. Any subsequent calculations that you need to do, like if there's a part B or a part C to the problem, you're always going to start with the limiting reactant to do any more calculations, because the limiting one is the one that determines how much you actually get out of the product. So now that you have the steps filled in, let's go ahead and put this into action. That's what we have the next and final practice problem for.